Welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Rick Campbell, your host, and with me today is Rick Chess. We're going to talk about poetry. So Rick, we have been talking over the years about this, and one of the things I've always wanted to ask you is, why do you write poetry? How did you begin in this endeavor?
Okay. Well, it was really sort of two different events in my life. When I first started out in college, I was actually an art major, and I was studying with a sculptor who was primarily a conceptual artist. After about a year of studying with him, I dropped out of school, moved back home, and tried to show my friends these works of conceptual art that I had been making. None of these works made any sense to them, and I was embarrassed, I was humiliated, and I decided that I could no longer practice as a conceptual artist. After not doing anything for 6 or 7 months, suddenly this sort of urge to make something started to emerge again, and I didn't know what I wanted to make, and I didn't know what medium I would make it in. And so I sort of thought about my options, and I figured that no matter what would happen to me in the rest of my life, I probably would always be able to afford a piece of paper and a pencil. And so I decided I would try my hand at writing. The other event was that right around the same time, I had my first serious girlfriend love affair, and one afternoon I found myself writing her erotic poetry. I'd never written a poem before. I hardly had even read a poem before, so I was quite amazed to see these words being shaped as lines of poetry, and yet they were, again, expressing an intense desire for which there were no exact words that immediately came to mind. And so I was trying to get at something beyond the language, though I wouldn't have thought of it in those terms when I started. How about you? How did you get started writing?
Actually, my story is somewhat, or my desire is a little bit opposite of yours. I've always felt bad that my visual artist friends, my painters, sculptors, wood carvers, when they give you something, you can put it on the shelf, you can hold it, you can throw it around, and then when I give them a poem, it's just a sheet of paper. It's like, well, 6 cents at Target, So my desire, I was drawn to songwriters, and I was in a community college, much like this one, in Palm Beach, Florida, West Palm Beach, Florida, and there was a guy who sat around the cafeteria playing guitar, instead of going to classes, unlike what they do here, I'm sure, and he would sit around and play songs, and sometimes it would be James Taylor, and I'd know that, and sometimes it would be Tom Rush or somebody like that, and sometimes I had never heard the song before in my life, and I thought I was, a fairly well-informed 18-year-old radio listener, and I asked him one day, well, whose song was that? And he said, I wrote it. And I was like, how could you do that? How could you write that? I had no idea that you could just write a song. I thought you had to listen to a song. And I was working at Morrison's Cafeteria, and I went home. I went to work that night, and I wrote the lyrics for 2 songs. And I brought them to this man, Daniel, the next day, and he kind of liked one. And the next day he came back and sang my song to me. And I was hooked. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a songwriter. And unfortunately, I couldn't play guitar. And then when Daniel and I split up geographically, I was left only with words. And there was an evolution over 5 or 6 years to poetry.
How did your writing change as the lyric impulse started to dwindle a little bit, and as you began to think more of the words on the page rather than the words written to be sung to the accompaniment of musical instrumentation?
Well, it was the last time I ever rhymed. I've never rhymed a poem since I decided that I wasn't a songwriter. But I tell stories. Most poets tell stories, but we don't call them stories. And I think my songs told a story. My songs would always be about traveling, or like your early, I didn't write erotic songs, but unrequited love songs, things like that. I meant to ask you, did the poem work?
Yes, it did. The relationship failed, but the poem
Auden
did
said
work.
poetry makes nothing happen, and I've never believed in that entirely, So what happened? You're a conceptual artist, and then you're a poet. Who did you did you read? What kind of reading did you do? What were the important books to you?
Yeah, well, I had been a fairly serious reader in high school prior to the time that I started writing poetry, but I hadn't really discovered modern and certainly not contemporary poetry. Not long after I started writing, I somehow just started to stumble across some poets whose work interested me a great deal. One of them was Allen Ginsberg, who I admired, I looked up to for many different reasons. His poetry was sort of one facet of the Allen Ginsberg project, the Allen Ginsberg personality. To me, he also represented, not only a beat hero, but a kind of mystical figure. And that's, for me, another part of the whole writing endeavor is
to be a bard.
To be a bard and to tap into some kind of spirit. I never was really interested in the political side to his work. I was much more interested in the sort of spirit and spiritual side and sort of the recklessness and wildness and enthusiasm of it. Right. These wonderful long lines and incredibly driving rhythms that build up to these terrific pitches, an orgasmic pitch almost. Other writers who I eventually found my way to sort of worked in the same kind of line, worked with the same kind of rhythms. One of the things I was interested in hearing you talk about the difference between writing lyrics and writing poems for the page was to see how you thought about the musical elements of the poems themselves. And, it occurred to me that maybe, in fact, if you are writing for the page, you would want to have lots of rhyme. Maybe not in rhyme, but maybe lots of kind of internal rhyme to bring a musical quality into the work. Anyway, for me, the musical quality that I found most engaging was the rhythm of the poems, which it was the part of the poem that would just cause me to have a very physical reaction to what I was reading. And so other poems who sort of work with that, other poets who sort of work with that kind of line are like Gerald Stern, C.K. Williams, and then going back to Whitman. And sooner or later I discovered that Whitman was taking off from the Psalms and from the parallelism in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's a long tradition of working not only with long lines, but interesting and complex sentences, and shaping those sentences across a number of lines and getting that interplay between the shape of the sentence and the shape of the line. So I was drawn to a few poets.
Galway Canal too?
Yeah, Galway Canal too. How about you? Who are some, when you stopped writing song lyrics, did you discover living poets right away?
No.
Had you already been reading living poets?
I was caught in this never land of being a songwriter without a guitar player. And my life was being lived. I was, as a vocation, I was a hitchhiker. So I was just, traveling across the country, and I learned to play harmonica. Drove a particular hitchhiking friend crazy learning to play harmonica. But I learned to play harmonica, and I turned to blues music, and I was going to be a blues harp player. So I had a couple years of rather serious attempts at being a blues harp player, playing in bands, stuff like that, which musically I think has a lot to do with my poetry. And then I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, working in a grindstone factory, and all my friends were since writers don't make money, especially poets, my friends were furniture movers and poets, and furniture movers and philosophers, and furniture movers and songwriters. And one Christmas, probably like the Christmas of 1985 or 1986, I actually got my first book of poetry, and I was 25 years old, and these people had tremendous taste. They started off with Richard Hugo's "What Thou Lovest Well Remains American," and Charles Bukowski's "Drowning in the Water and Burning in the Flame." So, I was given a poetry, I think by accident, or else these friends were so much more discerning than I could possibly imagine. I was given a poetry that I would have been prone to write, and I've never wanted to write something really other than that, and not that it's the opposite of Ginsberg, but those lines are much shorter. The rhythm is a little bit harder. It is less musical, stuff like that, and it's more narrative. And I think so. I've been drawn to that, and then it gets coupled weirdly with being a blues harp player in the sense of breath. You can't play a blues harp line as long as an Allen Ginsberg line.
Sure.
So my poetry tends to be 9, 10, 11 syllables wide.
Right.
And I think that plus one freakish thing, that being left-handed, when you're writing on a page with your pen, you can't write more than a few words before your hand smears the ink, and you have to drop down to the next line. So I have a left-handed syllabic theory.
Huh. That's interesting. It makes me think of a couple of things when you talk about you're writing a 9, 10, 11, 12 syllable line. That, of course, is basically the regular length of the line of poetry in the English literary tradition, the iambic pentameter line. A few weeks ago in a writing class I was teaching, I asked students to write a little poem in class, and I gave them a subject or some other little problem to solve, but I didn't specify, should you write short lines or long lines or medium length lines, standard length lines, etc. And as it turned out, all 13 students in the class wrote lines that were more or less 10 syllables long. I hadn't anticipated this, and yet it made me really experience firsthand the power of that line length.
Right.
That maybe there is a reason that's not a line length that is just imposed upon us, but there are certain things we're able to say in a more or less 10 syllable line. Another question I had for you has to do with experience. You've had so many interesting experiences, interesting jobs, lived in interesting different places, hitchhiked around, were a musician, etc. I wonder how important experience is to the writing of, the crafting of, composing of poetry.
I think the number one rule we're always given in every creative writing workshop, whether it's poetry, fiction, drama, is write about what you know, or write about your experience, and I think that's a good way to begin, right? I think it's a thing, and I certainly did that. I certainly spent years writing about what I've done, writing about, and I'm a writer I write about place. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I write. Rick and I we're talking like we don't know each other here, but we've seen these early poems of each other, and everybody knows that I went through 5 or 6 years of only writing about Pittsburgh River, and people wondering if I'd ever do anything else. So, write from experience, but you don't want to be limited to that, and that's where I wanted to. In fact, one of the things I was going to ask you about, I know that you're interested in heritage as a notion of experience, which obviously heritage is a much longer term. When we're talking about time, heritage is much bigger than experience. And I was wondering what you think about that.
Sure, okay. Well, I'll respond to that question. I also want to pick up on this bit of advice about writing about what you know. That, in fact, is what I always was told as I was a sort of a beginning student in some creative writing workshops. And I always understood that to mean write about what I had experienced firsthand. Write about what I had seen through my eyes, heard through my ears. And in fact, even until just a few years ago, I still only understood that concept as applying to firsthand experience. And I always felt as if I was doing something terribly wrong by writing about things that I could never have experienced, by jumping around in different historical periods and setting poems back in the ancient time, rewriting biblical stories. And so finally, I've started to think about that concept from a slightly different perspective. And when I think about writing about what I know, I think that certainly includes what I've actually lived through, but it also includes what I've learned through reading, through taking classes, through talking to others, and somehow that I can incorporate broader perspectives that I can bring to bear on my personal experiences, which enables me to see them from different angles in my poems, and in fact enables me to distort what may have actually happened in order to get at a kind of truth that might be hard to take if I didn't find a kind of tricky way to release it.
There's a latitude that you're being given there. I mean, the idea that Philip Levine once one of these sessions said, somebody asked him about this, writing about experience, writing about, are you autobiographical? And he said, well, why should I? I've always thought, why should I write about myself when I could write about somebody interesting? So the question, I think, had to do with persona, which,
Sure.
I mean, obviously, if we're only going to write about our own experience, then we have eliminated a lot of this tremendous poetry and these tremendous options of being someone else, of thinking like someone else, of running the risk or learning something. That's the other thing. Like, to me, our experience is to be in the world and to learn from this being in the world and to try to figure out how the world works. So if learning and discovering and journeying is experience, which I think it is, then like you say, you don't write about what you have only physically experienced or heard. You write about what you've thought, what you've desired, what you have failed to do. In fact, I would reckon that most of us write about what we have failed to do more than what we have done. Or we rewrite what we have done so that it doesn't fail anymore. That kind of... Richard Hugo said that creative writing classes give us a chance to talk about ourselves in a way that America doesn't give us, because we, for at least a few minutes, have an audience. People will listen to what we have to say about ourselves, but we tend to therefore make ourselves slightly better in the telling than we maybe are. I'm a much better person in my poetry than I am in person. I'm sensitive, and I tend to do the right thing at the right time, which unfortunately life isn't lived that way.
That's interesting. It makes me think about the importance of voice in a poem. I mean, when I hear you talk about creative writing allowing us to say some things that we don't get to say to each other in our daily conversations, in part because we have a kind of formal setting, but it's a formal and intimate setting in a little lyric or narrative poem. And one of the things that I've always felt is that even if one is writing from a particular cultural perspective or a particular heritage, mine happens to be Jewish and I write about that all the time, and even though the facts of that cultural perspective might not be known by your readers, the way they can connect is by your writing a poem that expresses and records a believable human voice. If they hear an authentic human saying these words that matter a great deal to him or her, if you're writing through the persona of a woman, the reader is going to be attentive in a way that he or she isn't ordinarily attentive in the rush of their daily experience. And I think that if you can express that voice and capture that voice, that enables you to include lots of foreign elements and details that readers will gladly settle for a kind of provisional understanding of. They don't really need to know. I mean, when you go back and read ancient poetries or whatever, you don't need to know all the rituals. You don't need to know all the weapons of war. It helps to have that information, but you can get a deep human truth without knowing what information you could find from footnotes or from a little scholarly research.
Well, it's like in my reckoning of heritage, I'm this working class steel mill kid from a little town outside of Pittsburgh, so heritage only begins for me a few years ago, and comparatively, but I think that I created the Jones and Laughlin steel mill. I don't care what Jones and Laughlin think. I made this steel mill. This is my mill, and I put these people in there, and I take them out, and I send them to work, and and sometimes I needed to send my father to a steel mill he didn't work in because he worked in the post office. But it didn't fit to have your father work in the post office, and I didn't feel bad changing that around. And recently I went home. And the mill's gone. The mill is completely obliterated. There's only a slab of gravel where the Jones and Laughlin steel mill was. And now I realize, finally, this mill is completely mine. I've always worried in the past that I was going to write a poem about and talking about the huge foundry and the ovens of the Jones and Laughlin, and somebody's going to say, well, that wasn't there. No, that was over here. That was on the Monaca shore. And I've always been a bit nervous about, if I had to do a poetry reading in my hometown, that these people were going to know more than me. But now, of course, they've wiped the mill out, and soon I'll be the only repository of mill mythology around.
That's great.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you about was, there's two things I wanted to talk about. One was who are you reading at the moment? If I think that people don't read enough poetry, and it's not just because I try to sell books.
Yeah.
Who do you read for when you want to just read a book of poetry? For whatever reason you read it.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you who I was reading on the plane.
Good.
I was reading actually a fairly new translation of Gilgamesh, translated by David Ferry, and I was also reading Elizabeth Bishop, so far from sort of living contemporary poets.
Right.
However, I read contemporary poetry all the time. One of my favorite new poets who I've just discovered is a poet who you've published recently, Frank Gaspar.
Right.
And that I read that book a few weeks ago and loved it, and now am eager to see more of his poems in the future. I read, a wide variety of contemporary poets, and I have a stack, from the floor to the ceiling in my study of books that I'm longing to get to. I'm reading, again, the works of a former teacher of mine, Stephen Dunn, in anticipation of a visit that he's going to make to my college soon. I could list dozens and dozens of poets. Some of my favorite contemporary poets include C.K. Williams, if you know his work, and Louise Gluck.
Louise Gluck, right.
And Alan Shapiro, and a host of others. How about you? Who are you reading these days, and who are you excited about?
I used to only have three. I had three heroes: Richard Hugo, James Wright, and Philip Levine. And unfortunately, James Wright and Richard Hugo are dead. So I was left for a long time. I felt in a void. Like, who am I going to get to replace these people? I have started to replace them with T.R. Hummer.
Oh yes,
Terry Hummer. I like a lot. John Balaban, whose book I just found in Pittsburgh, and I couldn't believe I hadn't read this book yet, Words from My Daughter. I'm reading Rick Chess at the moment.
Great, well that's good.
I'm reading, what else? Who else am I reading? David Romvet.
Oh yeah, I love his work.
My whole life, I think my whole education, unfortunately, was this way, that I just randomly run into things.
Sure.
So I was in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago, and I bought all the books that were for $4, or I got all the books that somebody gave me.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what I'm reading.
Yeah. Can I jump in for just a second? One of the things that I really want to emphasize is the importance of reading. I think that you can't be a good writer without being a good reader. And I know that probably what I learned best when I was in graduate school was how to read poems. I studied with a master poet, Donald Justice, and I learned a tremendous amount from him about writing, but I learned more from him about how to read in a way that would be useful to me as a human as well as a poet.
I'm the same thing happens to me. I'll go into a writing workshop, and I think, number one, being rather prejudiced toward those who do read, that you can tell who's been reading poetry by the way they write. But if you come right out and ask them, well, who do you read? So many people who want to write poetry aren't reading poetry.
Yes.
And I'm trying to figure out, well, how are they going to do that? How are they going to discover what's been done?
Right.
How are they going to discover what you can do?
Right.
How are they going to grow beyond themselves?
Right.
How are they going to meld their voice with the voices?
Yes.
That's how I discovered. You run the risk. I ran the risk of sounding like a cheap imitation of Richard Hugo and a cheap imitation of Philip Levine.
Yeah.
But if you're serious about this, you're going to do it,
right,
and you're going to grow through it, and you're going to become who you are.
Right. I agree with that. Imitation has a long history, a long, noble, and dignified history. And though we live in an American culture that praises originality, I think that we're making a mistake if we overlook the importance of imitating those writers who move you.
Right. Carpenters learn by watching carpenters. I always ask somebody, well, if I got my first hammer yesterday, would you hire me to build your house? No, you have to do something. You have to pay some dues. Well, I think we're coming to around the end of our time here, so I'd really like to thank you, Rick, for being here. It's been nice to talk to you.
It's been great talking to you.
We could have gone on and on. I think that poetry is something that you and I, and if not many people, could discuss at length.
Indeed.
So I want to thank everybody for being at Writer to Writer. I hope to see you again later.